As you walk into our garden, the very first thing you notice is this, my garden wall. It's tucked away beneath the neighbour's tree with a rather imposing fence sitting on the top, and despite years of trying, absolutely nothing seems to want to grow here. In fact, I eventually gave up and filled it with plastic plants just so it had a little colour. Now I should probably confess something. I'm not really a gardener. My garden is more of a happy little jungle that's been left to its own thing, and honestly I quite like it that way. But this wall just looks sad. Every time I looked out of the window, that's all I could see. Then, because my brain has absolutely no sense of proportion, I had one of those dangerous little thoughts. What if I built the Shire instead? And as usual, one idea quickly became about 50. The plan sounded wonderfully simple. Clean the wall, paint the fence, add some faux grass, build a few Hobbit homes. Easy. Also, I thought. Remember the bit where I said the idea grew? Well, suddenly it wasn't enough for the fence to be simply black. It had to become part of the scene. I could picture it perfectly. A warm sunrise, soft mist rolling across distant hills, the kind of backdrop that would make the whole village disappear into Middle Earth. So I reached for my acrylic paints, and very quickly I discovered that blending paint on an enormous garden fence is far harder than it looks. I somehow created something that looked like a rainbow had exploded, and to make matters even better, I came down with the flu. So this gloriously colourful disaster sat in the garden for the next 3 weeks while I recovered. It was quite a sight. There was only one thing left to try, my airbrush. Now, if you've been watching this channel for a while, you'll know you've never actually seen me use one before, and there's a good reason for that. I'm absolutely hopeless with it. But I thought, it's only a garden fence. What's the worst that can happen? Several hours later, I was completely covered in tiny specks of paint from head to toe, but somehow the fence actually looked better. The colours softened, the clouds appeared, and it finally started looking like the backdrop I'd imagined. Once I'd safely returned the airbrush to wherever dangerous tools go when they've caused enough trouble, I finished everything with an ordinary paintbrush, adding distant fields, rolling hills and tiny trees along the horizon. There was still one thing missing though, that soft misty morning feeling. After rummaging through the shed, I found a tin of grey spray paint that I normally use when laser etching metal. Probably a much safer option than getting the airbrush back out again. A few gentle passes and finally the backdrop was finished. The wall itself was mostly flat, but I wanted Bag End to sit proudly on a little hill overlooking the village. Trying to keep the costs down, I remembered an old slab of clay that had been sitting in the shed for about 8 years, ever since I sold my pottery kiln. It was no longer much use as clay, but it seemed perfect for building the shape of a hill beneath the grass. Now came the Hobbit houses. I designed every one of them in Affinity Designer, my favourite piece of software, carefully stacking layer after layer until the doors, windows and timber frames all came together. Once I was happy with the designs, I printed them out to test the size against the wall before cutting every individual piece from craft foam on my laser cutter. Those foam pieces became templates for everything that followed. Then came the big question, what should the houses actually be made from? This village was going to live outside all year round, so whatever I chose needed to survive the British weather. Luckily, I'd already been unintentionally running a few long-term experiments. Some plaster fairy doors had survived outdoors for over a year. A Hobbit bird feeder, covered mostly in craft foam, had been hanging outside my craft room for nearly 2 years. And thanks to Willow redecorating her bedroom, poor Hagrid's hut had been abandoned on the garden wall for months through rain, frost and sunshine. Completely accidental, but actually rather useful. I tested everything I could think of: epoxy putty, garden cement, homemade paper and plaster clay, and good old craft foam. The epoxy putty looked promising until I realised I'd need a small fortune to build 9 Hobbit homes. Once cured, it also proved surprisingly brittle. That idea didn't last long. The cement was certainly cheaper, but incredibly messy and rather disappointingly just as fragile as the putty. The homemade paper clay was lovely to sculpt, surprisingly durable, and even allowed me to laser engrave decorative details into it. But the craft foam kept winning. It was lightweight, easy to cut, easy to assemble, already proven outdoors, and probably the cheapest option too. In the end, most of Hobbiton would be built from craft foam, with a few other materials mixed in where they made sense. The windows and frames would all be laser cut from craft card before being filled with UV resin, making them completely waterproof once finished. Next time we finally start building the very first Hobbit homes. Seeing the tiny little houses appear on the wall was the moment this project finally began to feel real. I can't wait to show you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.